how does gut health fit with metabolic diseases? And remember, we're not all specialist scientists.
Okay, so I think I'll rather go back to where it started and work towards gut health because I think it's all related. If you think about Rooibos, originally people were saying it helps for colic babies, and that was sort of one of the sort of earlier indications of potential gut health and of this soothing effect of crying babies that don't sleep. But I have to go back to how our research originated. I met Professor Hubert from the Agricultural Research Council in 2006, and she has been working in the industry, agro-processing, but with a particular interest in the chemistry of Rooibos. And so she said, look, we have a lot of information about Rooibos, the products, fermentation, which is not really fermentation, oxidation of Rooibos, and the different compounds, how it affects the compounds, and we would like to see whether we could attribute some of the health properties that is sort of anecdotally sort of accepted on a more scientific basis. So at that time we said, well, we have various cell culture models that mimic human disease processes, specifically metabolic disease. So we look at cells such as muscle cells that we can culture in the lab. Muscle is very important for peripheral glucose uptake, which is a big problem with diabetics, for example, or insulin resistance. We have that. We can look at the liver. We have liver cells. Liver is very important in terms of metabolism of carbohydrates and fats, as well as fat tissue. So we can look at different tissue types. So we did the experiments. The initial steps is firstly to see, is Rooibos potentially, or chemicals in the Rooibos potentially harmful or toxic to the cells in the body? And obviously they're not. We can give it to the cells at relatively high concentrations before we see a decline in metabolism of the cells, so we know it's safe. So the next step is obviously confirm that we saw that the Rooibos was able to increase the metabolism of these cells, specifically muscle cells as well as liver, and that this increased their ability to take up glucose, to respond better to insulin stimulation, which is a problem in your initial metabolic disease. So we saw these on what we call in vitro level, that Rooibos does really affect cells in a positive manner. We also then spent a lot of time looking at specifically mechanistics that could explain those responses, and we identified some of the enzymes and transcription factors which affect cell metabolism. So all good and well, very sound. And then we had very little money, so we had to scrounge money where we could get, and started to do some initial animal experiments in diabetic animals, so that it improved the glucose levels, or the blood glucose levels, and modulated some of the fat levels, the lipid levels in the blood. So this is, I mean, very promising for a product that it could be beneficial to, for example, people that have metabolic disease, to help to enhance their health in terms of metabolism. We then went further to see, okay, fine, how does it work? We did what is called a PK study, or pharmacokinetic study. So in Rooibos, a major compound, and it's a compound unique to the Rooibos species, aspartame. We used that as a marker compound, and we gave a mouse a lot of Rooibos, and then looked at the levels of aspartame, and the levels are extremely low. Very difficult to trace, as various other studies have shown that the levels or the amount of aspartame that is actually absorbed is very little. And that would go for a lot of the other phenolic compounds. As well as that they are treated as foreign or xenobiotic compounds, potentially harmful and quickly metabolized by the liver and excreted to the urine. So they're a very short lifespan. And then we said, but hang on, how do these effects occur? Because we did trace minute amounts in the urine, so we know it's absorbed in small amounts. So we did further experiments that showed that the aspartame in that instance is mostly transported in between the lining cells of the gut. So it's not transported in large amounts. So it has a profound effect, but not absorbed in high amounts as would be typical for caffeine or a drug, for example. So there must be something more to it. Then we looked at the enzymes that were involved in, for example, the digestive tract, to see whether these enzymes that are responsible for breaking down carbohydrates into glucose, which then after a meal would push up your glucose levels. And we found that aspartame greatly inhibited alpha-glucosidase, which is the enzyme that breaks down your sugars into glucose, which then would delay the absorption of glucose or sugars after a meal. That is very beneficial, and that is already one of the, I would say, mechanistic effects, apart from the cellular effects. So then our latest research, we said, look, we know that the microbiome, which is the bacteria in the gut, is a very important aspect and is well known to be related to metabolic disease, diabetes, cancer. And it's incredible that you are essentially inoculated with certain bacteria phenotype at birth. And you retain that phenotype for the rest of your life, except when you take antibiotics, for example, as well as if you change your diet persistently. So in other words, we have, if you have a bad phenotype from your mother, you're more prone to have, for example, metabolic disease and diabetes. So we know that. So we, at the Medical Research Council, have a unique primate model. We have rivet monkeys that have been on a westernized diet, so it's a basic cafe diet, call it that. So they get high-fat diets fed to them, and sugar as well. So they get added sugar. So typically what you would have your McDonald's with, for example, Coke. That is essential. Now what is very remarkable about this is that we follow these monkeys over time, and they start presenting with exactly the same metabolic phenotype and eventually develop type 2 diabetes. So that occurs very quickly. Over a 2-year period, they're already vastly insulin resistant, and after about 3 years, most of them will start having high glucose levels. So that was an excellent model. So we took some enriched Rooibos extract, enriched with aspartame. We fed these monkeys 90 milligram per kilogram of this daily, and then for 28 days, and then after 28 days, we washed them out. So we took the treatment away. So what was remarkable is when we used the stool samples and analyzed the bacteria, the microbiome has good and bad bacteria. Now, if you eat something wrong, how terrible you feel, because that's the bad bacteria. Essentially, we have what's called firmicute bacteria ratio, and that ratio is indicative or a measure of gut health. So we found that after treating these monkeys for 28 days, that some of these beneficial bacteria were enhanced. And these bacteria, well, I'll mention a few, such as Akkermansia musciphilia, has been associated with human metabolic disease, including diabetes. And what that bacterium does, on your gut lining, there is a layer of mucin. And it actually breaks down the old mucin to ensure a smooth or healthy mucin layer. Other bacteria that we also found that was greatly enhanced by the Rooibos treatment was the Eubacteria species. Now they are butyrate producers, and butyrate is one of the molecules that suppresses immune response or immunity, inflammation, sorry. And so we've identified 4 or 5 of these beneficial bacteria, and they're closely related to the barrier or the gut epithelium layer, to its integrity and enhancing its integrity. So from there, I think I will pass over to Sylvia, because she's actually, that's her role, is looking at the barrier function, which is how does the gut barrier protect you against disease?
Okay, so we all know that the gut is basically there to digest the food and to absorb nutrients. But with all the food that we ingest every day, there's, as we've heard already, trillions of bacteria that we ingest, as well as toxins and antigens in general. So the gut also provides a barrier so that these substances don't cross into the body and can cause harm. So what is known from the literature is that in diabetic patients, for instance, they have higher levels of products that bacteria produce in the gut, in their blood. So that suggests that somehow these products got into the body, and it was found out that that is through a disruption of the intestinal barrier. So it's also called leaky gut syndrome, and the inflammation that this causes is also thought to contribute to the dysregulation of glucose metabolism and in general metabolic health. So my research interest is really to see how can Rooibos help with that.
And how can Rooibos help with that?
Yeah, I think in more than one way. Firstly, I think that the bacteria that are that Rooibos has an effect on, that are protective in terms of the actual gaps in between the epithelial cells, so that less of these harmful toxins will cross over, as well as the bacteria that are producing things like butyrate, which will suppress inflammation. So the gut has special cells that actually promote inflammation, and it's part of the sort of protective response. But if the balance is wrong, they start producing excess amounts of pro-inflammatory products or cytokines, and these are initiators of inflammation throughout the body.
Yeah.
So if you have an unhealthy gut barrier, you really have chronic inflammation disease, which affects, for example, insulin resistance is the first one. Obesity is strongly related to chronic inflammation. So the whole process really has a domino effect in terms of if the gut health is out of balance, or the phenotypes, bacterial phenotypes, there are also what they call pathogens, that has an effect on your, for example, fat cells. Your fat cells are initiators of a lot of inflammation. People think that fat is only there to store fat. It's actually an organ that produces its own inflammatory products, which then perpetuates the whole dysfunction of the metabolism. And that actually causes insulin resistance, eventually relates to relates to type 2 diabetes, for example. Obesity is a direct cause of that. So there's a strong relationship between your gut itself as an initiator of the disease, comes back to you are what you eat, it is so. And I think that this is where Rooibos as a way to get a lot of these beneficial phenolic compounds without adding to your calorific. So if you eat a lot of fruit or say you also get antioxidants, you also get a lot of these phenolic compounds, but you also add a lot of sugar.
Correct.
And that. So Rooibos is a very good way to push up the phenolic consumption without adding to your calorific intake.
Now, but it's not Rooibos alone, right? Just to be clear, it's not the case that if I drink 20 cups of Rooibos a day, that I don't ever have to worry about obesity, I don't ever have to worry about gut health.
And I think that is the most important aspect, is that you have to combine that with a healthier diet.
Yeah.
Although in the monkey model, where those monkeys been on a high-fat diet for 15 years, some of them, there was a dramatic improvement in their cholesterol, LDL, for example, as well as the oxidation of the LDL, in other words, the making the sort of pro-atherogenic or the type of cholesterol that causes blood vessel plaques, to lower that, as well as the general antioxidant status of your lipids. So it has beneficial effect even if you're not following a very healthy diet. But yes, I think generally people must realize if you're eating a bad diet, you're not really removing the cause of your disease.
Yeah.
It's not a treatment as such. And this is important, is that if you're type 2 diabetic, you have to continue with your drugs, take your drugs. In most cases, Rooibos is good with your drugs, the common metformins or sulfonylureas. If you're on statins, high level of statins, watch out for Rooibos. It will push up the levels by 300%. So there is the potential for drug interaction with certain drugs, and we've studied them. So one is statins. If it's high consumption of Rooibos with statins, you are probably going to have a liver injury.
All right, that's treatable, guys. High consumption of statins with Rooibos, not a good combination. Sylvia, let me bring you in here. And perhaps let's talk a bit about the role that aspartame plays in cardioprotection.
A colleague of ours has also been working a long time on aspartame, and her focus is, Dr. Johnson's focus is basically a condition that is found in diabetic patients called diabetic myopathy. And it's basically where the heart muscle is damaged and produces less heart output. So they have been working on a mouse model of mice that become spontaneously diabetic, and they have used aspartame to improve the oxidative status of the heart in those mice.
Just to be clear, you're saying that the heart challenges that patient would be facing would be as a result of them having diabetes?
Yes, so
Okay.
Diabetic cardiomyopathy is specifically in diabetic patients.
And what do you understand about what's happening in the mice that could be of use to humankind when we get the clinical trials done down the road? What is happening that then reverses it?
Okay, so I think, well, this is Dr. Robert Johnson's work, but
Of course.
essentially, a lot of focus is on cardiovascular disease. In other words, the effect on the vasculature, and most heart attacks are caused by blockages of the blood vessels to the heart. But in diabetics with high blood sugars, you have, as she says, diabetic cardiomyopathy. So that is a weakness or very vulnerable heart muscle. The heart itself is impeded. So these people do very badly when they do have a heart attack. Obviously, the heart is much more damaged. But what we've seen with aspartame, and which is a major component in Rooibos, is that in these diabetic hearts, there is a balance in terms of the substrate they use to make energy. So obviously, heart is very energy, uses a lot of energy because it has to pump all the time.
Yeah.
And in diabetics, there's an imbalance between the glucose used versus the lipid that is used. And in doing that, by using more lipid to create the necessary energy, you actually increase the oxidative stress. And that's what damages the heart muscle. So treating these cells with, or these hearts with aspartame actually normalizes or increases the glucose usage versus the lipid usage in the mitochondria of these cells. So it helps to ameliorate that imbalance in the way the heart muscle is using the substrate, the lipid versus glucose substrate.
And so the earlier question then still applies. Can Rooibos help then with the cardiac dysfunction?
Well, we still need to establish that in the human model, but there's strong indication that that would be the case.